She raised her glass like she was offering a blessing, the kind of toast that might follow a lifetime of love and gratitude. Laughter rippled through the room as guests leaned in to hear what my daughter, my only child, had to say about me on my 70th birthday. And then, with a smile as polished as her pearls, she said it. It's time we start the next chapter for Mom. We've arranged for her to move into a care home next week. The room didn't go silent. That would have been a kindness. Instead, there was that awkward clatter of cutlery, forced chuckles, murmurs of surprise pretending to be support. I smiled too, because that's what you do when your dignity is publicly stripped from you. You smile, and you stay upright. I'd built a life inside these walls. I'd buried my husband from this house. Rachel knew what it meant to me. She looked me in the eye and discarded me anyway. But what she didn't know was that by morning, she'd be the one without a home. If you've ever felt the ground shift beneath you because someone you trusted decided they knew what was best for you, then this story is yours. Hit that like button if you've ever been spoken over, sidelined, or silenced in a moment that should have belonged to you. And if you believe dignity isn't something anyone can assign or take away, make sure you subscribe. This isn't just a story about revenge. It's about precision, about remembering who you are when someone else tries to rewrite your ending. Leave a comment if you've ever had to reclaim your voice from someone who thought they knew better. You're not alone. I never needed much. A quiet home, my books, a morning cup of tea in the sunroom, that was enough for me. My name is Eleanor Winters, and I turned 70 last spring. But I didn't feel 70. I still had my mind, sharp as ever, and my body, though slower, still carried me through the garden beds and around the old house I had poured my soul into with my late husband, Peter. He'd passed 10 years ago, cancer, swift and cruel. After that, the house became my anchor. Every creaking floorboard, every ivy-covered brick, it was ours. Mine now. Rachel, my daughter, was different from the beginning. She had Peter's wit, but none of his softness. Even as a child, she was ambitious, calculated. I admired it, even feared it a little. She was my only child, and I gave her everything I had. Every bedtime story, every sacrificed weekend, every dollar I could spare when she went to business school. Over time, her visits grew shorter, less frequent. She'd breeze in with designer handbags and tension in her jaw, barely listening as I told her about the garden or the neighbors. Always in a hurry, always on her phone. Her husband, Tyler, was even worse. Slick hair, fake smile, and the kind of man who spoke to you like he was doing you a favor just by showing up. The first time they hinted at selling the house, I brushed it off. Rachel had mentioned that the property value had skyrocketed. Tyler offered to connect me with someone. I remember saying, "This house isn't on the market." Rachel just smiled and said, "Not yet." I started noticing little shifts. Rachel began managing my prescriptions, at first helpful, then controlling. One day, my refill didn't arrive. When I called the pharmacy, they said my daughter had requested a delay. I confronted her. She dismissed me like I was being dramatic. "You forget things, Mom," she said, patting my hand like I was 5. "We just want what's best for you." She started showing up with forms I didn't understand. "Just routine stuff," she'd say, placing a pen in my hand. I signed. I trusted. But the pit in my stomach grew heavier. A month before my birthday, a woman showed up at my door. She introduced herself as a care consultant. I was confused. She said she'd been hired to evaluate my daily needs. I told her to leave. She left a pamphlet behind, neatly folded with the words, "Serenity Oaks, Assisted Living," printed in blue script. When I called Rachel, she sighed and said, "You're making this harder than it needs to be. We just want you safe." Safe. Like I was some fragile vase on the edge of a shelf. Then there was the time I caught Rachel in my study, rummaging through drawers. When I asked what she was looking for, she said, "Nothing important." That was the moment I began to understand. This wasn't about safety. It wasn't even about care. It was about control. She began managing my calendar, canceling appointments without telling me. One day I realized she had rerouted my mail to her address. She said it was more efficient that way. I told myself not to be paranoid, that this was what daughters did when their mothers grew old. They stepped in, they helped, but it didn't feel like help. It felt like erasure. I tried to talk to her, really talk. I made tea. I sat her down. I told her I didn't want to leave my home, that this house was more than bricks. It was my life. She smiled like I'd said something adorable and naive. "You won't even remember this place in a year, Mom?" she said softly. "Let us take the burden off your hands." Burden. That word stayed with me. The final straw came when I noticed my bedroom furniture had been rearranged. Rachel said it was safer that way. "You don't need sharp edges," she said, eyes scanning the room like a blueprint. The knives had disappeared from the kitchen drawers, replaced by plastic utensils. I hadn't agreed to any of it. That night, I sat in the dark of my living room and watched the shadows move across the floor. Something inside me shifted. Not anger, not yet. Something quieter, heavier. I didn't feel old. I felt buried. And I was starting to understand who was holding the shovel. It didn't stop after the care consultant. It didn't stop after the pamphlet. Rachel began, circling me like a hawk waiting for stillness, interpreting my every decision as weakness. She started showing up unannounced, always with a clipboard, always assessing. My pantry, too disorganized. My wardrobe, a fall risk. Once she walked into my bedroom and pulled open drawers without asking. "We're just making sure you're supported," she said, jotting down notes. But nothing about her presence felt supportive. It felt surgical, strategic. The conversations turned clinical. She would drop terms like cognitive decline into sentences without context. She'd call me on speakerphone in front of Tyler and say things like, "She's been a bit confused lately." I wasn't confused. I was exhausted. Then came the assessment. A geriatric specialist she had arranged through her network, who showed up under the pretense of a routine check-in. I agreed to it, if only to prove I wasn't the woman Rachel was trying to portray. The test was thorough: memory recall, visual patterns, language processing. I passed. Not just adequately, exceptionally. The doctor even smiled and told me I was sharper than many of her 40-year-old clients. Rachel didn't smile. She said nothing the whole ride back to her car, just slammed the door a little harder than usual. 2 weeks later, I heard voices in the backyard. I looked out from the kitchen window and saw Tyler shaking hands with a man in a blazer. I walked out and asked what was going on. Tyler laughed. "Just talking shop, you know. This lot could hold 2 properties easily, maybe 3. I asked him to leave. He said, "Just thinking about the future, Eleanor." Rachel didn't even pretend to deny it when I confronted her later. "This house is a resource, Mom. You're not using it." That's when I started locking my doors. Still, the small humiliations crept in. She replaced my bathroom towels with disposable ones, hired a cleaner who referred to me as the old lady, canceled my weekly bridge games, and told my friends I was slowing down. I could feel myself disappearing by degrees, but I kept my voice even. I never shouted, not once. I just started watching more closely. I saw how she monitored my prescriptions, not for my benefit, but to create dependency. I saw how she rationed information, delaying my mail, withholding updates about bills, subtly suggesting I was incapable of managing on my own. The walls of my life were being shifted an inch at a time, quiet enough not to trigger alarm. But I noticed. Then came the birthday. She planned the whole event. I hadn't asked for anything elaborate, but the guest list was long and carefully curated. Former colleagues, a few distant relatives, her husband's business partners. She catered it, decorated it, spoke about it like she was throwing a fundraiser, not a celebration. I stood at the edge of the living room as people mingled, sipping champagne and making polite conversation. The house smelled of roses and pastry, but underneath it all, I felt the tremble of something colder. Rachel called for attention. She tapped her glass. The room went still. She began with kind words, talked about my strength, my wisdom, my years as a professor. Her voice dripped with admiration, sweet and shallow. And then she turned. "I've been thinking about what's best for Mom as we look to the future," she said. It's time she had a little more support. So starting Monday, she'll be moving into a beautiful assisted living residence. Serenity Oaks applause. Confused, hesitant, polite. I didn't speak. Couldn't. She had announced my displacement like a promotion, like she had handed me a gift. People looked at me, some with pity, some with approval. I smiled, because it was the only armor I had left in that moment. I felt the floor tilt beneath me. My breath went shallow. My spine stiffened. I nodded, even thanked her. Then I went upstairs, locked my bedroom door, and sat on the edge of my bed for a long time in silence. When the house emptied, I didn't clean. I didn't cry. I walked into Peter's old study, a room she never entered, and opened the top drawer of his writing desk. Inside was a worn leather folder. My hands trembled, not from age, but from realization, because tucked between his pension papers and personal letters was something she hadn't thought to look for. The deed, in my name, dated years before Peter died. Not joint ownership, soul. That was the moment the shift happened. Not grief, not confusion, clarity. She thought I was fading, but I had never seen more clearly. The next morning, before the sun reached the windows, I made tea and sat with that folder on the kitchen table. My hands no longer trembled. The heat from the cup grounded me as I reread each line of the deed. My name, not ours, not shared, just mine. Peter had done this after his diagnosis, quietly with foresight. I remembered the conversation now, vague at the time, full of gentle phrases like, "just in case," and "you'll need control." I hadn't realized then how prophetic it was. By mid-morning, I called Samuel Holt. He was an old colleague of Peter's, a retired estate lawyer, and one of the few people I still trusted. His voice cracked with warmth when I told him what was happening. "Bring everything," he said. "Come right away." We sat in his study that afternoon, the air heavy with books and old paper. He read through the documents slowly, carefully, his brow furrowed only once. When he finished, he looked up and nodded. "You still hold this house, and if we act now, she won't be able to touch it." He outlined my options in calm, deliberate terms. The most secure? Transfer the property into a legacy trust, a legal structure that would shield it from Rachel, Tyler, or any manipulative claim in the future. It would mean permanent independence and final authority. I signed the necessary forms that day, quietly, deliberately. There would be no ceremony for this moment, just signatures, just resolve. Samuel also suggested revoking the durable power of attorney Rachel had slipped into my life. I hadn't realized how much she'd built her authority around that document. It was the foundation of her control, her excuse to monitor my finances, my mail, my health care. With it gone, her reach would vanish like smoke. I began to move like a shadow, carefully, intentionally. I froze the joint bank account, transferred my prescriptions back under my own name, reinstated my access to the utility bills, and updated all mailing addresses. When the locksmith came, he didn't ask questions, just changed the locks like it was any other job. He handed me the new keys with a simple nod. I spent the evening preparing letters, One to my doctor, one to the local postmaster, one to Rachel, a formal cease and desist drafted by Samuel stating that she no longer had access to my personal or medical decisions, that any further interference would be treated as harassment. The power had shifted, and with every step, my voice came back to me, not raised, not angry, but firm, like stone pulled from a riverbed. In the mirror that night, I looked older, not from fear, from purpose. Rachel had miscalculated. She thought love made me weak. She forgot that I had been building something all along, not just this house, but myself. The next morning arrived with an eerie calm. Sunlight crept across the front steps as if nothing had changed, but everything had. I stood in the foyer dressed with quiet intention, simple slacks, a crisp blouse, the same way I used to dress when I taught my first lectures, measured, dignified, unshakable. At exactly 9, their car pulled into the driveway. Rachel stepped out first, carrying a duffel bag I didn't recognize. Tyler followed, dressed too casually, as if moving his mother-in-law out of her home was just another Sunday errand. They didn't knock. They used the old key. It didn't work. Rachel jiggled it again, then looked up at the camera I had installed only days ago. Her brow creased. She rang the bell. I opened the door slowly. Behind me in the corner of the hallway stood Officer Langdon and Officer Riley, calm, neutral, professional. They'd seen the documents Samuel had prepared. They understood the situation. "Mom," Rachel said with forced brightness, "we're here to help you pack." I stepped aside just enough for her to see the officers behind me. "No, Rachel, you're here without legal standing, and you're not coming in." She blinked. Tyler frowned, stepping forward. "Eleanor, let's not make this messy. We're just trying to move things along." I raised the envelope in my hand. "This is a formal cease and desist. You are trespassing. Your power of attorney has been legally revoked. The house is now under a protective trust." Tyler reached for the paper. I pulled it back. "This is for Rachel." Officer Langdon stepped between us. "Sir, I'll need you to remain on the sidewalk." Rachel's voice cracked. "What are you doing?" "I'm taking back my life," I said. "You planned to take this home. You orchestrated every step, but it's mine, and now you're no longer welcome in it." Tyler laughed. "You're confused. You don't know what you've signed." Samuel appeared from behind the front door, holding a legal folder, calm as ever. "She knows exactly what she signed, and you'll find everything airtight." Rachel's face drained. Then, as if insult were required to seal the injury, a tow truck pulled into the driveway. I had made the call an hour before. Rachel's car was parked illegally across a neighbor's drive. The driver didn't hesitate. The hook caught the undercarriage. Rachel spun, shouting at him, her voice unraveling. "Stop! That's my car!" "No," I said quietly. "That's just your exit." Her phone was out within seconds. "You can't do this. You're not well. You're unstable." I turned to Officer Riley. "Am I being investigated for anything?" He shook his head. "No, ma'am. You're well within your rights." Rachel looked back at me, desperate now, the calculation slipping into panic. "I was just trying to protect you." I stepped forward. "You tried to erase me. Slowly, politely, publicly, but I don't owe you silence anymore." The officers escorted them off the property. Rachel shouted that she would be calling her lawyer. Tyler threatened lawsuits, but their voices grew distant as the gate closed behind them. I stood in the silence, the same silence I once feared. But now it felt clean, controlled. Justice, I'd learned, didn't always roar. Sometimes it just locked the door. It didn't take long for the cracks to spread through their world. Rachel's lawyer, after reviewing the trust and revocation documents, advised her to drop any claim quietly. There was no case. Tyler's development deal, the one he'd been piecing together using projections from the sale of my house, collapsed within the week. Investors pulled out. Their names began to circulate through whispers in the community, stories traveling faster than they could control them. A neighbor told me Rachel and Tyler had moved in with his sister temporarily. Smaller house, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, far from the sleek kitchen and high ceilings they'd envisioned. She sent emails, long ones at first, dressed in guilt and self-pity, then shorter ones, then silence. There was one voicemail I listened to once, her voice shaking, saying she never meant for things to get this far, that she just wanted what was best for everyone. I deleted it, not out of spite, out of clarity. Some things didn't need revisiting. I began to breathe differently in my own home, not as a guest, not as someone preparing to leave, but as the owner, the architect of my own peace. I replanted the rose bushes, cleaned the upstairs windows myself. For the first time in months, I played the old vinyl records Peter loved so much. One evening, I stood in the doorway of the room where she'd made the announcement. The same light pooled across the floor. The same furniture stood exactly where we had placed it decades ago. But something had changed. She had tried to take the house. Instead, I reclaimed myself. Getting older doesn't make you fragile. It makes you refined, clear, the kind of clear that sees through smiles and softened lies. Rachel thought my silence was surrender, that my stillness meant I was slipping. But I wasn't fading, I was watching, learning, choosing when to act. I've learned that control taken quietly can be taken back just as quietly, with paper, with preparation, with patience. Not everything has to be loud to be powerful. This house taught me that. It was never just a place to live. It was where I raised a child, loved a man, built a life brick by brick. And when she tried to bury me under the foundation of her own ambition, I remembered who poured the cement. I don't know if Rachel will ever understand the harm she did. That's no longer mine to carry. What I know is this: I stayed. She left. She tried to put me in a home. Instead, I reminded her who built this one. If someone has ever mistaken your age or your silence for weakness, this story is yours. Tap that like button if you've ever had to rise quietly, reclaim what was yours, and remind the world that dignity doesn't come with an expiration date. Subscribe for more stories where justice doesn't shout, but strikes with intention. And if you've ever had to stand your ground when someone tried to rewrite your future, tell me in the comments. Your voice matters. Your story has weight. Because revenge isn't always about anger. It's about clarity, strength, and knowing exactly when to close the door. Sometimes justice doesn't whisper. It simply doesn't flinch.